Anne Scripps, heiress to the E.W. Scripps media empire, was a divorcee looking for love. And then tall, dark, and handsome Scott Douglas walked into a bar and straight into her heart. 9 months later, Anne was a blushing bride, certain she'd found everlasting love with the charming Scott. Except Anne didn't know about the dark secrets her husband was harboring, secrets that would lead to murder. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love, and this week I'm putting a spotlight on the heiress and the hunk. As the great-great-granddaughter of James E. Scripps, founder of the Detroit News, the life of Anne Fraser Scripps was one of affluence and privilege. Primarily raised by her grandmother in Loudonville, New York, a wealthy suburb of Albany, Anne was the daughter of Captain James E. Scripps III, described by New York Magazine as the, quote, classic, rich, unhappy alcoholic, and his wife, also named Anne, who had a history of manic depression. Her education included the Convent of the Sacred Heart, which was an exclusive all-girls Catholic school, the Duchesne Residence School in Manhattan, and the New York School of Interior Design. In 1964, Anne debuted at the Schwarzenberg Palace in Prague, and later at the Debutante Cotillion and Christmas Ball in New York City. For a time, Anne worked as a secretary at international textile distributors, but as People magazine noted, Anne was very much a product of her generation, or as New York Magazine put it a little more succinctly, she was raised to be a flawless companion to her husband, a good mother, and was expected to run her home with a sort of cultivated ease. Friends described the petite, dark-haired Anne as having led a protected existence, and as one friend noted to New York Magazine, she could be, quote, sheltered, delicate, and a little naive. In 1969, 23-year-old Anne fulfilled her destiny when she married Anthony X. Morell, also known as Tony, who was a bond trader on Wall Street. The ceremony, held at the posh and iconic St. Regis Hotel in Manhattan, included Princess Immaculata Habsburg of Vienna as one of the bridal attendants, and Victor Emmanuel Jr. of the House of Savoy as an usher, who just happened to be a direct descendant of the King of Italy. Anne and Tony's nuptials warranted mention in the New York Times and received a 3-page feature in Town & Country magazine. The following year, the couple welcomed their first daughter, Alexandra, or Alex, as she was known, with youngest daughter Annie making her entrance a few years later. The young family made their home in the village of Bronxville, located in wealthy Westchester County outside of New York City. Anne, described by her friends as a homebody, enjoyed attending church on Sundays, gardening, and entertaining. Above all, she devoted herself to her 2 daughters. Alex described her and her sister's childhood in picturesque Bronxville to New York Magazine as idyllic, complete with a 7-bedroom house with white pillars and spacious hallways perfect for roller skating. Anne did crafts with the girls, took them for ice cream, and walked them to and from school every day. Country club memberships were a way of life. Tony Palm Beach, a cherished playground. Despite the wealth and the privilege, Anne was not flashy or over the top, preferring, for example, to wear a modest wardrobe most days, and she was even known to shovel her own sidewalks following snowstorms. So while Anne relished living a simple life that revolved around home and hearth, Tony was more interested in the fast lane. Friends told People magazine he loved to party, and with all that partying came a lot of drinking, which hastened the end of the marriage after 19 years. As one friend told New York Magazine, Anne was, quote, the last of that generation of Stepford wives. And in fact, Anne didn't even know how to drive a car until she was 40. Following her divorce, she felt lonely, adrift in a sea of marrieds, which made her feel just a little bit desperate, hungering to be anchored once again to the comfort and security of a marriage and a husband. It wouldn't take Anne long to find her new mate. Less than a year after her divorce was final, 42-year-old Anne met 33-year-old Scott Douglas at a Super Bowl party at Kelly's Sea Level, which was a popular pub in nearby Rye, New York. So there was Anne minding her business, eating a hamburger when Scott rolled up and introduced himself. As you can probably guess, Scott was charming and handsome, with the requisite thick black hair and hot bod. He even wore leather jackets and tooled around town on a motorcycle. Kind of sounds like Bo Brady from Days of Our Lives, if you remember him from back in the day. However, despite all of that sexy rough and tumble, as one acquaintance said in the Seattle Times, Scott presented as, quote, sweet, kind, debonair. Anne was quite taken with his come-ons and the way he poured on the flattery, just what this vulnerable, lonely divorcee needed and wanted to hear. Scott ran a house painting business out of his apartment in Greenwich, Connecticut, and so Anne hired him to paint her house. And it wasn't long before Anne and Scott moved on from paint samples to, well, let me just borrow a Real Housewives phrase. Instead of filling up paint buckets, he was filling up her love tank. While Anne was smitten with her hunky new beau, she was the only one, because Scott didn't exactly fit in with the Bronxville set. He was a high school dropout who Alex described to People magazine as, quote, not very bright and very inarticulate. He attempted to drum up clients for his painting business at the country club by passing around his card like it was going out of style, which one just does not do at a country club. And because he was so tongue-tied, he was woefully awkward when it came to making small talk with the ladies who lunch crowd. Needless to say, Anne's circle of friends was not gushing over one Mr. Scott Douglas. But Anne didn't care. All she could see was a hard-working, industrious family man who was cute, available, and showered her with love and affection. A man who wanted her. A man she could spend the rest of her life with. A man who could provide her with the emotional security she so desperately craved. In the end, that was all that mattered to her. While Scott was busy wooing Anne, dazzling her with heartfelt declarations of devotion, he was also busy neglecting to fill her in on some of the important blanks about his life. To be fair, even people who'd known Scott for years couldn't really say they knew him because he was a master of compartmentalizing his life. According to True TV, some of Scott's friends would offer such glowing commendations as, quote, Scott Douglas was one of the nicest guys you ever met, and a Boy Scout of a guy, while others claimed that he, quote, had no respect for women, said women are nothing but a bunch of whores. That really sounds like a Boy Scout, doesn't it? Like Anne's ex-husband, Scott also hailed from Rye, New York, and was the son of a widowed single mother, while his father was an alcoholic who was buried in Potter's Field in Hart Island. Rye, like most of the towns and villages in Westchester, was populated with overwhelming prosperity. So Scott got to see up close and personal just what kind of lifestyle money could afford you. But rather than go to college and get a degree or bust his tail to build a business, in order to get that type of lifestyle, Scott's retirement plan centered around marrying a rich woman. According to New York Magazine, after Scott dropped out of high school, he moved in with his girlfriend Phyllis Creighton, who was 12 years older and had 2 kids. He told her, for some reason, that he was enrolled in Boston University, but he wasn't. And after 3 years together, Scott moved on because he was behind on that retirement plan. He needed to get cracking. As True TV reported, Scott had a real way with wealthy older women in particular, with his friend Wallace Rouse commenting that, quote, Anne Scripps was small potatoes compared to some of the gals. There were Mercedes, Cadillacs, all pulling up to see him. The gals he went around with were very substantial, very beautiful. He was an earth shaker, had a personality to make movie stars look like a bunch of bums. In addition to his girlfriend juggling act, Scott kept Anne in the dark about the child he fathered out of wedlock. There actually may have even been 2 children. I couldn't confirm this. He didn't tell her about his drug problems, his drinking problems, his fits of depression, or his therapy sessions. She also probably didn't know about his taxidermy hobby, which was the same hobby that Norman Bates had. Just put that in your mental Rolodex. So here's lovely, lonely Anne, primed and ready to say I do to the handsome, taxidermy-loving gigolo. And that's exactly what she did in October of 1988, 9 months after that fortuitous meeting at a run-of-the-mill sports bar, and only 5 days after Scott proposed. Her friends were less than thrilled when an ecstatic Anne announced her engagement and plans to marry right away. Many tried to talk her out of it, But as a friend told People magazine, quote, "How do you put restraints on a grown woman?" As far as her friends were concerned, there were so many reasons not to marry this man. From the age difference, the class differences, the fact that her daughters didn't like him, and in fact, Alex, never one to mince words, reportedly told him he was trash. This is what the Seattle Times said. There were the whispered rumors of infidelity, the drug use, but Anne did not want to hear it, and nevertheless, she persisted. It was a quickie wedding in her living room with a judge officiating, a far cry from the social event of the season that had been her first wedding. None of her family came, and Scott told her that the reason why his mother couldn't come was because she was dead. She wasn't. Scott must have thought he was getting quite the wedding present when Anne didn't even have him sign a prenup. One of the 20 guests in attendance told Newsday in reference to Scott, quote, "He was classless, a name dropper. You could see that immediately. He was shifty. He had a slimy, weak handshake, didn't look you straight in the eye, had no conversation, had nothing to say. What did he talk about? House painting? He didn't speak our language." Needless to say, I don't think anyone was throwing rice at the happy couple that day. As these things go, at first it was a blissful union, with Anne gleefully introducing her new husband to any and everyone, while he convincingly played the role of adoring spouse. Adding to this happy picture, within a year of the nuptials, Anne and Scott's daughter Victoria, aka Tori, was born. Everyone agrees that the couple longed for a child of their own, that they doted on her, and that Scott was actually a halfway decent dad to his youngest child. As Alex told People, quote, he'd bring her these capsules that dropped into water and turned into sponge animals. She, meaning Tori, loved that. So on the outside, it seems as though Anne and Scott have defied the naysayers and built a happy, fulfilling little family unit. Well, clearly that wasn't really the case. We wouldn't be here otherwise, if any of that was true. Because for one thing, Scott did not get the memo that he was not Mr. Scripps, that Anne's money wasn't his for the taking, that the retirement plan he'd been hatching, the one where he'd marry the wealthy older woman and live the high life, was not coming to pass. Even though Anne hadn't bothered to have her hubby sign a prenup, she had no intention of being a blank check for Scott. She expected he would keep working and contribute to the upkeep of the house. Instead, Scott wanted her to buy him a BMW and new clothes. He wanted her to set up joint checking accounts and, in general, support him in the manner in which he thought he should become accustomed. Anne wasn't going for any of it, though, because according to True TV, Scott screamed at Anne in front of friends, quote, "I've gotten more from women I've dated 2 weeks than I've gotten from you in 2 years. Greedy much?" So while Scott wasn't getting everything, or really anything, that he wanted, he did still manage to extract at least some flesh from his wife. As True TV reported, her brother, it's Anne's brother, said that his sister, quote, paid for everything. He would charge my sister for any kind of job he did in the house. If he was painting houses, what did he do with his money? It's not long before things really start to unravel between the couple. Anne's daughters, who'd never thought much of Scott to begin with, tolerated his crassness because he seemed to make their mother happy and adored their little sister. However, the cracks started to appear when he criticized Anne for everything from her parenting to her friends. Alex told People magazine he became, quote, very mean and controlling, and Annie noted that, quote, after a while, he didn't care who he argued in front of, even Tori. To escape the increasing tension, Scott, who had kept his Greenwich apartment, started spending more time there, essentially treating it as a bachelor pad of sorts. And in fact, many of Scott's neighbors never even knew he was married. Authorities say he spent a lot of nights out on the town with his female house painting clients, so that solves the mystery of where his money was going, because he was going out on a lot of movie and dinner dates. And as True TV noted, his friend Tom Linson Myers said, quote, he used to party a lot. There was never any mention of his wife. Anne was totally clueless about the dating game that Scott was starring in, as he worked overtime to keep her in the dark about his extracurricular activities, often leaving home in the middle of the night and being super shifty about who he was with, where he was going, or what he was doing. However, what wasn't a secret was her husband's drinking. Alex told people that Scott frequently came home drunk and that the drinking led to violence, everything from throwing furniture across the room to smashing glasses, and even slamming Anne into the wall. Increasingly, Scott was having an exceedingly hard time keeping a lid on his seething resentments. As people reported, following a dinner party one night, he smashed Anne's head into a stone driveway in front of witnesses. Another time, at a family wedding reception, Anne accepted the offer of a dance with her former brother-in-law. For her trouble, Scott yanked her off the dance floor and called her a slut. For Anne's daughter Alex, she'd had enough, and she moved out of the house. This was just the beginning of Scott slowly starting to isolate Anne from her family and circle of friends. He didn't like them, and they for damn sure didn't like him. So he'd give Anne a hard time about how snobby and stuck up they were. I mean, to be fair, they do sound a little stuck up, but that's their prerogative. And not that he was this great guy. Still, to appease him, she stops spending time with her friends and instead spends all of her time with him. But it doesn't matter because he just keeps going off the rails. I mean, it's a bottomless well of need. You can never fill it up. Friends detailed a number of horrific incidents to Newsday, such as Anne confiding that Scott had pushed her down the stairs, kicked her, thrown her to the floor, and that one time he'd pulled her hair so hard she was sure he'd pull it clean out of her scalp. According to court documents, Anne said he even once tried to push her out of a moving car. In one of his finest moments, because again, he's a prince of a guy, Newsday reported that for their second anniversary, instead of the traditional cotton gifts, so I don't know, like a nice tablecloth or a pillowcase or something, Scott gifted the 105-pound Anne, tiny, petite little Anne, with a bathroom scale, telling her, quote, "You better use this every day. I don't want to see an inch of fat on you." In addition to the physical and verbal abuse, he questioned everything she did, from demanding to know who she was talking to on the phone or fuming when they would take their daughter, Tori, for walks around the neighborhood, and Anne would want to stop and chat with the neighbors. Anne confided in friends she believed Scott had tapped the telephone lines due to some strange wires she found in the basement. She'd even taken to talking in code when on the phone with friends anytime Scott was around. Friends and family urged Anne to get the hell out. But what kept her there is that she was terrified he would take her daughter, or their daughter Tori, and disappear, something he'd threatened to do multiple times. It seems Anne had decided to try and go along to get along in order to keep him from kidnapping Tori. Alex told 2020 she also thought embarrassment over another failed marriage was another shackle keeping her mother bound to Scott. At one point in 1991, Anne did move in with Alex for a time. She even went to court for an order of protection against her husband. However, Scott managed to woo her back, promising to change, even taking the step of attending AA meetings. It was all for show because, as True TV reported, according to Annie, he only went to 2 meetings, so he's not serious about getting sober. Anne informed Scott she wanted a divorce, but Scott wasn't going to go quietly. He wanted $250,000 for Anne's freedom, and so she agreed to it, but would only go through the court system because, as her friend Gretchen Devlin told Newsday, she was afraid Scott would try to blackmail her. So by this point, the once lovey-dovey couple now had separate bedrooms, but Scott would not let Anne have even a moment's peace. Gretchen told Newsday he'd wake Anne up at all hours of the night, pinning her to the bed as he screamed obscenities, that she was stupid, a slut, accusing her of cheating, saying horrifying things like, "You have a disease, you're disgusting." He'd accuse her of renting porn, of having STDs, which left Anne scurrying to the gynecologist in order to prove him wrong, or bolting to the video store to make sure there hadn't been any dirty movies accidentally rented in her name. Other nights, he threatened to cut her into pieces and scatter her across New York before taking off with Tori. Anne was so terrified of Scott, authorities say she started to sleep with a claw hammer under her bed. By December of 1993, the situation between Anne and Scott reached the point of no return. For starters, Anne had discovered that Scott had stolen Tori's birth certificate and her footprints, along with other important papers, lending credence to his continued threat that he would take their daughter and run. On December 6th, Anne once again took the step of petitioning the family court for an order of protection, including asking that Scott be evicted. According to People, a judge granted the order, which kept Scott from assaulting Anne or running off with Tori, but, crucially, the judge did not kick him out of the house, which, if the guy is beating Anne, slamming her head into concrete driveways and throwing her into walls, why on earth would he be allowed to stay in the house? Somebody make that make sense for me, please. Anne sought some additional help because a few weeks later, she went to the local chapter of the National Coalition for Family Justice. They advised her to go to a women's shelter. And I have to imagine that for a woman of Anne's breeding, her station of life, she would have found a suggestion like that to be mortifying, shameful. And indeed, she didn't take the advice. And as her friends and family say, despite those beatings, the insults, the threats, Anne held on to a slender thread of belief that ultimately Scott really wouldn't make good on any of his threats. In what was a recurring theme for the heiress, as Anne's friend Sharon Bowles told the New York Times, quote, "She was very trusting and maybe a little naive. I think she thought he wouldn't do anything to her." As Newsday reported, that Christmas Eve, Anne revealed to her longtime friend Gretchen that she wouldn't be attending a holiday open house that night because she'd just been released from the hospital with a scratched cornea and was sporting a patch over her eye. Anne later sent her friend a Christmas card with the handwritten words, quote, "Wouldn't you know, instead of decking the halls, I would get decked myself." Scott, meanwhile, surprise, was unspooling in spectacular fashion. New York Magazine reported that he'd also confided in folks that holiday season, telling his friend Eleanor Hannon about the pressure he was under and how depressed he was. She said he was creeping her out because he kept taking off his shirt to show her how buff he was, and that his paranoia was on high because he kept babbling about the phones at his house being tapped, saying that people were coming into his apartment, and on top of all that, he's fidgety, unable to sit still, pacing, popping out of his chair, tapping his foot repeatedly. Now, I'm not a doctor, I just play one on this show, and it sounds as though Scott was in the midst of a break of some kind, a psychotic break, frankly. On December 29th, Anne made yet another frantic attempt to get Scott out of the house, taking her daughter Annie to the courthouse to try and get another order of protection. They were told that the judge was on vacation and to come back in the new year. December 31st, 1993, New Year's Eve. Tony Morell, Anne's first husband, called daughter Annie to wish her a happy new year. As Tony told New York Magazine, a highly agitated Scott kept jumping on the phone, yelling and screaming. After arguing with him, Tony called him a bum and to, quote, "do the town a favor and get out." This exchange apparently triggered another blowout between Anne and Scott later that day. Anne was in tears and her daughters were concerned. Annie told 2020 that her mother shared with her that Scott had said, quote, "The threats were over. Something more has to be done." Understandably, this alarms Annie, who volunteers to cancel her plans for the evening. Scott, who'd sequestered himself in his room upstairs to watch TV, made repeated trips downstairs to refresh his vodka and orange juice. Anne ultimately assured Annie that Scott was just having one of his, quote, moods, and that Annie should proceed with her plans for the evening. Annie, with some additional coaxing from her mother, decided she would go to that New Year's Eve party. A little after 10, Anne walked her daughter to the door and kissed her goodbye. 3:30 a.m. Annie has locked herself out of her house, and she's standing outside, desperately pounding on the door, screaming for someone to let her in. She'd had a bad feeling all night about her mother, a nagging fear that she should have stayed home instead. The silence on the other side of the door wasn't helping. All the noise Annie was making prompted neighbors to call police, who arrived to find Annie, who instructed them to bust down the door because she was afraid for her mother. Authorities complied and raced up the stairs in search of either Anne or Scott. They found Anne in Annie's room. She was unconscious, laying on her back, the bedsheets drenched in blood. The source, a gaping hole in the back of Anne's head and slashes to her face. EMT Robert Monaco told New York Magazine he couldn't tell where her head ended and the pillow began. The family's new spaniel puppy huddled against her, whimpering as it tried to comfort the barely breathing Anne. Neither Scott nor his 1982 BMW were anywhere to be found. The couple's daughter, Tori, was discovered sleeping in another room. Unfortunately, she had not slept through the assault, but in fact had witnessed it. At one point, she hid under the bed as her father went through the house, calling her name. She later told authorities, quote, "Daddy gave Mommy many boo-boos. Why is Mommy wearing war paint?" Immediately, the police zeroed in on Scott, launching a frantic search for him. Police reached out to his brother Todd, who Scott had called after he fled the scene to say, quote, "I've done something really bad this time." It was hours before Scott's car was found deserted on the Tappan Zee Bridge, the engine running, the lights on, the doors unlocked. In the back seat was an overnight bag filled with toiletries. On the front seat, a bloody claw hammer, the very one that Anne had kept hidden under the bed to protect herself from Scott. The very one he used to smash her skull open. The initial assumption was that Scott had jumped 150 feet into the frigid waters of the Hudson, so authorities dragged the river in search of his body, but to no avail. According to New York Magazine, among Bronxville's admittedly small, blue-collar crowd, Scott, inexplicably, was seen as something of a hero, someone who, quote, took the money and ran, and got away with it, a have-not who took from a have. So, he beats this woman to a pulp with a claw hammer and they want to throw him a parade? Again, somebody make that make sense. Lending credence to this took the money and ran theory, Anne's friends and family revealed that Scott had purchased camping equipment as a Christmas present for himself, and that he'd left the car on the bridge to fool everyone into thinking he jumped, which was similar to the plot of the Mary Higgins Clark novel I'll Be Seeing You, which had come out in summer of 1993. And that, in fact, Scott was alive and well and waiting to strike again. Authorities continued to scour Bronxville for Scott, but again, nothing. There was no activity on either of the two bank accounts he'd set up with two different names with two different social security numbers, nor any activity on any of his credit cards. The Scripps family offered a reward of $100,000 for his capture. Still nothing. As police continued their desperate search for Scott, Anne was comatose in the hospital, barely clinging to life. Scott had beat her in the head with that claw hammer approximately 6 times. He also carved up her face with a steak knife. Her skull shattered, the wounds too massive to repair. Anne never regained consciousness. On January 6, 1994, Anne Scripps Douglas succumbed to her injuries. She was 47 years old. In an interesting and kind of heartfelt twist, Anne's first husband, Alex and Annie's father, Tony, happened to be in need of a liver transplant, and the girls made sure that he got Anne's liver the day after she died. Meanwhile, Scott, still in the wind, was charged with second-degree murder. The family, understandably, was still on edge as they feared for their safety as well as that of 3-year-old daughter Tori. All they could do was watch and wait and worry, convinced they'd spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulder. It would take 3 months for the mystery of Scott's whereabouts to be solved. On March 30th, 1994, a mechanic on the Metro-North Railroad saw something unusual that had washed up on the banks of the Hudson in Riverdale. It was the body of Scott Douglas. Having been in the water for 3 months, there wasn't much left to Scott Douglas, so he was identified through dental records. Authorities found $507 stuffed in the pocket of his blue jeans. The solid gold watch he wore recorded his time of death at exactly the stroke of midnight. Scott Douglas was 38 years old. Tori Douglas, the 3-year-old little girl who saw her father bludgeon her mother to death, was adopted by Anne's sister Mary and her husband Robert Carmody. The couple decided to raise her in rural Charlotte, Vermont, reasoning that removing her from anything connected to the tragic environment surrounding her mother's murder would be the best way to allow her to heal. Despite those best intentions, Tori, whose name was legally changed to Victoria Scripps Carmody, had her own demons to bear. At the outset, Tori led a tranquil, ordinary existence, playing t-ball, drums and piano, going to slumber parties, and even joining a brownie troupe. And in the 5th grade, she made the honor roll. While her adoptive parents worked to provide her with a stable family unit, they pointed to the release of Our Mother's Murder, a Lifetime TV movie about the tragedy surrounding her parents, as a major trigger for her eventual downfall. Her classmates teased her, her schoolwork suffered, and she started hanging out with a not great crowd. And eventually, she turned to drugs. As the Burlington Free Press reported, in August of 2011, when 21-year-old Victoria was pulled over in her BMW. That's interesting. Keep that in the back of your head, BMW. That'll come up later. But when they pulled her over, authorities found 193 bags of heroin. The state trooper who pulled her over noticed track marks on her arm, and according to court documents, Victoria confessed to a 6-bag-a-day heroin habit. There would be drug and burglary charges, admissions to running a crack house, stints in jail, and rehab, all while burning through a 7-figure inheritance and eventually resorting to hawking stolen family heirlooms to support her drug habit. Her last known incarceration was in 2015 at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York, following a conviction for drug use, possession, and hanging out with drug dealers. She was released after she wrote a 10-page letter to the court that detailed her plan to get her life back on track. Victoria wasn't the only one of Anne's daughters to suffer following her murder. Annie, who'd found her mother's mangled body, who'd rode in the ambulance with her to the hospital, was never able to move past that horrific New Year's Eve. As Alex told New York Magazine, quote, "Imagine finding your mother like that, her head torn apart and her face all ripped up. So my poor sister Annie had to live with that. I just don't think she ever got that image out of her head." Though the girl's Aunt Mary had adopted Tori, Annie had actually tried to adopt her sister herself, but at 22 was deemed too young to take on the responsibility. Though Alex and Annie kept in touch with Tori through the years, her adoption, in a sense, was another loss. Annie got married, had a son, but struggled with alcoholism and seemed adrift as she searched for increasingly elusive happiness. Sensible Alex was forced to prop up her sister emotionally as Annie blew through her inheritance on numerous plastic surgery procedures. She floated from job to job, all while desperately searching for love following her divorce. continually wrestling with the guilt and anxiety she felt about her mother's murder, believing if she'd stayed home that night, she could have stopped the dominoes from falling. More tragedy followed as the girl's paternal uncle was killed in the 9/11 attacks and their father dying in 2005 after his life had been extended by the gift of Anne's liver. Annie fought to cope with these heartbreaks, but the struggle was a mighty one. As her son went to live with his father following anxiety issues that he had at school, her substance abuse escalated, resulting in hospitalizations and multiple trips to rehab. There was even electroshock therapy, which robbed her of happy memories, but not the one memory she could never forget. September 24th, 2009. It was a normal Thursday. Annie took her son to school and then ran errands before meeting Alex for lunch, manis, and petties. They spent the evening at Annie's house, laughing about the silly things that sisters often laugh about. Alex left at 6 p.m., and as she told 2020, Annie was fine. After Alex left, Annie sent a quick text message to a girlfriend before getting into her car, a BMW. 7:30. Annie calls her on and off boyfriend, Chris Smith. The connection was bad, but he was able to make out that she was at the gas station getting cigarettes. 7:45. Annie drove to the center of the Tappan Zee Bridge and exited the car, striding to the rail of the bridge as she smoked a cigarette. 7:49. Annie called Chris Smith again as she walked just past light post 13-9, the exact same spot on the bridge where Scott Douglas had leapt to his death 15 years prior. And at 7:50 p.m., she did the same. Like Scott Douglas, Annie Morell Petrillo was 38 years old. Annie's suicide was a near replica of her stepfather's. Same make of car, same spot, same exact age. A suicide note written in pencil was found inside the car, with goodbyes to her son, friends, and family. There was a line to her little sister Tori. Tori, wish you loved us. Me, certainly loved you. I always missed you. And an ask of her late parents. Mommy and Daddy, please find me. Understandably, questions and theories abounded about why Annie chose to recreate Scott Douglas's gruesome death for her own. Another friend suggested it might have been Annie's way of saying that her life actually ended the night Scott bludgeoned her mother to death. Either way, jumping off that bridge wasn't a coincidence. Alex vowed to 2020 she won't cross the Tappan Zee Bridge ever again, saying, quote, never. Too painful. If you or someone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline 24 hours a day at 800-273-8255. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. Also, while you're there, you can find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus episodes and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.